We've all seen it before. Whether it's on Forensic Files or CSI or Law and Order, the scene is set. You're in a courtroom, a man or a woman is on trial for a very serious offense. Their life's on the line. The atmosphere is palpable. The prosecution calls in a bloodstain pattern analyst who is asked to give his or her expertise to the situation. The expert says that to the untrained eye, blood at the scene of the crime can look random and erratic. But to experts like her, the blood tells a story. The size and shape of the droplets can tell them what type of wound that created that pattern, and they can even identify the object that was used. You see, when an assailant uses a blunt force object like this hammer, he leaves an imprint in the blood pattern of every action he made. The jury listens closely, writing down notes so that they can understand and remember these important and complex details. With a mix of scientific sounding jargon like trajectory and orientation, the analyst says that she is able to determine with absolute certainty that the defendant was at the scene of the crime and was, in fact, the perpetrator. The prosecutor wraps up the expert's testimony with persuasive proficiency, and he details to the jury how the testimony that they just heard reaffirms what the state already believed. The defendant is guilty. You sit back in your living room and think to yourself, wow, can't believe it was actually him. Thought it would have been the other guy, but can't argue against the science. The outro music plays and the police good guys leave the courthouse triumphant, knowing that they got their guy. Trust the science. It's a phrase that we've heard a lot. And in most cases, I would agree. Science is the best tool that we have for finding out the definitive truths of the universe. But what if I told you that most of the forensic science that is admissible in court and is used every day in courtrooms to help to decide the fate of people's lives, the forensic science that has basically created an entire genre of television, it doesn't even meet the fundamental requirements of science? Well, that would be the findings of the independent, non-profit, non-governmental, highly regarded National Academy of Sciences. In their 2009 review into the reliability of forensic science, they stated, quote, "Forensic tests do not meet the fundamental requirements of science in terms of reproducibility, validity, and falsifiability. The integrity of crime laboratories increasingly has been called into a question, and perhaps of more concern is the lack of good data on the accuracy of the analysis conducted in forensic science disciplines and the significant potential for bias that is present in some cases." You may be thinking, dang, so blood spatter analysis is bogus. I guess that kind of ruins the show Dexter. But no, that report was not just questioning forensic blood spatter analysis. It challenged the validity of basically every non-DNA forensic science out there. We're talking hair analysis, bite mark analysis, tool analysis, tire track and footprint analysis, handwriting analysis, and even fingerprint analysis, among others. It's kind of embarrassing to say it, but we've all been fooled. Don't get too down on yourself. Basically, our entire judicial branch has been fooled too. So, how did this happen? Well, like many things, its cause is multifaceted. The way that these types of analytical evidence were even allowed in the first place is pretty interesting. A sizable percentage of forensic practices were born out of pretty weird scenarios that usually involve some individual being a little too obsessed with some bodily orifice or fluid. If we look back at blood spatter analysis, we will find that the first few times it was accepted as admissible evidence was when famed blood spatter analyst Herbert McDonald testified to its scientific validity less than 50 years ago. His influence on the current state of forensic science cannot be overstated. His impact was very far-reaching. He was even a witness in the O.J. Simpson trial. Mr. McDonald had been researching bloodstains on a grant from the Department of Justice from the basement of his home, utilizing animals and cadavers. Although he published his findings in 1971, it wasn't until over a decade later that his findings were actually deemed admissible evidence in a trial. Before then, bloodstain analysis had been rejected by courts numbers of times. The use of bloodstain pattern analysis in a case spread like wildfire, and not long after, it was admissible in all 50 states. This is because of a legal principle known as precedent. The way precedent works is basically if something has been used or argued upon successfully in a prior case, it can be used again. This is something that is at the heart of the problem of forensic science in the courtroom. Science, by definition, looks towards the future, constantly disproving theories in favor of newer, more accurate ones. But judges look to the past to determine the constitutionality of evidence and find precedent for legal procedures. These conflicting systems are destined to cause problems because as science advances, the older, less reliable sciences of the past will still be admissible in court due to legal precedent. The next issue is with the so-called experts. Once Mr. McDonald's testimony was allowed, he began traveling across the whole country to police departments where he gave courses on bloodstain pattern analysis. The word expert alludes to some specialist who really knows what he or she is talking about and has devoted their life towards gaining a full understanding about a subject. But here's the kicker. You can become a certified bloodstain pattern expert with just a 40-hour course. That's it. Not even 2 days of learning, and you can find yourself on the stand testifying before a jury. And the same goes for some other forensic practices like arson experts. So, with the advantage of legal precedent and how easy it is to become an expert, these forensic practices spread across the country really quickly. Leora Smith, in an examination of the history of forensic science in America, said, quote, "Although the reliability of blood spatter analysis was never proven or quantified, its steady admission by courts rarely wavered. Blood spatter testimony spread through courtrooms across the country like a superbug." Proper testing was not done for these fields, yet they were allowed into the courtroom. Now, why have many actual studies by highly regarded scientists like those in the National Academy of Science challenged the legitimacy of many forensic fields? I mean, when these specialists are describing what they see in the evidence, it sounds pretty convincing. Well, it's not like these fields are complete nonsense and just made up. They do rely on some factors of the scientific method, and they are fairly logical. But being mostly accurate and somewhat consistent is not good enough for science. Science requires that hypotheses be proven and replicable. Many forensic disciplines sit somewhere in between truth and nonsense. Let's take bite mark analysis as an example. Usually, a forensic odontologist will be tasked with matching a defendant's teeth to a bite mark found at the scene. They'll find certain characteristics and try to match them to teeth patterns. But as journalist Radley Balko of the Washington Post points out, quote, "There has never been any real scientific research to support its two main underlying premises, that human dentition is unique and that human skin is capable of registering and recording that uniqueness in a useful way." Basically, it's all subjective. The odontologist cannot produce data and tell you what the margin for error is in a certain case. He can just look at two bite marks and say, yeah, I think they're from the same person. But in reality, bite mark experts have had a hard time even agreeing that certain marks on skin were made by teeth, as opposed to a bug bite or some other cause. There's just too many factors at play to be certain of anything. The thickness and elasticity of skin, the pressure of the bite, whether or not the bite was during a struggle. That's not to say that these disciplines have no practical applications. They have just not been properly tested enough to be deemed a legitimate science. Forensic odontology first came into existence to help insurance companies identify crash victims. And in that case, the bar for accuracy doesn't need to be that high. But when you talk about possibly putting innocent people on death row, we better be sure that the science that puts people in cages is legit before we throw away the key. According to a report done by the President's Council of Advisors in Science and Technology in 2016, quote, "Expert witnesses have often overstated the value of their evidence, going far beyond what the relevant science can justify. The evidence that these experts present, if they are to be admissible at all, should be considered circumstantial. They can help prove guilt among other evidence, but they should not be treated as conclusive evidence on their own. Unfortunately, the causes of these illegitimate sciences can already be seen. In a report done by the Innocent Project, they stated, quote, "The misapplication of forensic science is the second most common contributing factor to wrongful convictions, found in nearly half of DNA exoneration cases. The faults of forensic sciences are causing real damage. These are people who have had decades of their lives unjustly taken from them. Their lives will never be the same. And this is especially true for those that it is already too late for." In a review done by the Department of Justice on cases in which the FBI provided microscopic hair analysis, the DOJ found that, quote, "Out of the 268 cases where examiners provided testimony, erroneous statements were made in 257 of them, or 96% of the cases." 96%. That's a terrible statistic. It's even more terrible when you learn that 9 of those defendants have already been executed. You would think that after multiple bombshell reports done by the NAS and the PSACT, the tides would start to turn in our courtrooms and this evidence would stop being permitted. But unfortunately, you'd be wrong. A court in this country has yet to rule bite mark analysis inadmissible. This seeming divide between the consensus of the scientific community and the consensus of the courts was summed up beautifully in an article by the Washington Post. Quote, The fact that no court has yet to rule against the scientific evidence that nearly every scientist in the country agrees isn't scientific at all is a damning indictment of the courts and their inability to self-correct. Science itself is incredibly adaptive, but the courts in this country are not. That leaves the issue in the hands of us, the people. We make up the juries that decide these cases. The sly, potent techniques of wannabe scientists infect our courts, but the real power still lies with the people. We need to stop indulging and falsely believing in practices that have yet to prove themselves as legitimate. Forensic science makes up for, a great time on television, but that's where it needs to stay. These disciplines need to be seen as no more than circumstantial evidence and opinions by less than qualified people. The public needs to be more aware of these flaws in this forensic science community. In America, it's quite popular to dread performing your civic duty. When someone says they have jury duty, it's usually accompanied by groans. But you should want to do jury duty, because God forbid you find yourself sitting in the defendant's chair. Wouldn't you want you on your own jury? I definitely would. Thank you.